All right, guys, I got a brand new .NET Core web application. This is .NET 6. No frills, no identity, nothing. If you open up the program.cs, it's straight out of the box from doing a file new project. As you can see, the pipeline is very short, very straight to the point, and you can add whatever you want. So I'm going to show you how to put a few things together, including Entity Framework, so that you can begin your project. You can use any type of database you want, but most applications need a database. I'm going to use MySQL, so I'm over here in Workbench, which is a free Oracle product. You can download Workbench, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new database. So we're going to call this Notes, since we're going to build a simple note application. Okay. We're going to build a few tables within Notes, and we're going to try to do our best to do some database best practices. If you see me doing something that you think could be done better, leave it in the comments so that other viewers can appreciate that. So we're going to create a couple of tables. And each table I create, I'm going to use an ID column. That's going to be the primary key, not null, auto increment. We're going to do a last modified, which is going to be a date time, which is going to be not null. And we are going to add a couple basic fields like the note itself, which let's make that a varchar 255. And there's no point in having a note table without a note, so it should be not null as well. And why don't we have another column called created, which would be different from the last modified date. But this again is going to be a date time. And again, not null. Once you're satisfied with your table, come on back to Visual Studio. I launched it earlier and didn't show you what it looked like. Just your basic web application. Before you make any changes to it, looks like this. If you hit F12, you go to Elements, and you start poking around. You can change it to be the way you want using your developer tools before you modify it with code as far as any design changes. But as you can see, it's got the basic navbar, lots of bootstrap type classes. You can change this to be material or whatever you want. So lots of decisions to be made with your design of your application. We're going to leave it pretty basic for right now. All right, let's go ahead and use Entity Framework right away to scaffold out this thing. Now we're going to need to install a couple of NuGet packages before we can proceed with that. Basically, you need Entity Framework Core Design, Tools, and then another third package for whatever type of database you want. So let's go ahead and get those. Go to Browse and make sure you're pointed at NuGet.org. We're going to search for Entity Framework. And let me turn off my pre-release here. There's Entity Framework Core. Install that. It's often referred to as EFCore. There's Design. Install that. Accept. There's Tools. Install that. Accept. I realize the most popular database these days seems to be SQL Server. If that's what you're using, go ahead and install this one. I'm using MySQL, so I've got two choices. I've got the Pomelo and I've got the MySQL one. Of course, I keep saying I'm using MySQL. I'm using a branch off MySQL some years back called MariaDB. So I'm going to look for Pomelo, and that comes up with this MySQL. So install it. And of course, if you're using MySQL, you also need the MySQL design as opposed to the SQL Server design, obviously, right? So we'll go ahead and get that. Now this isn't the only choice. There's obviously other ways of doing everything. Go ahead and accept that. There's also PostgreSQL there, and SQLite. So all these things will work with Entity Framework, but we're just picking the ones, you're just going to pick the ones that you're going to use in your project. All right, let's move on to the command line stuff that you got to do. So let's get started with that. So I'm going to go ahead and you can either use the package manager console or you can use developer PowerShell. The scripts exist for both. They're just slightly different. So we got to pick one for this video and use that. I'm going to use the package manager console. Now, in the bottom, you should have package manager console. If you don't, you should be able to find it. Go up to tools, I believe it is, NuGet package manager console, and click that, and then it will appear. You can dock it in the bottom like I did. So the command's going to be scaffold-db context with capitals on the S and the D and the C. Give it a space, enter some quotes, server equal to, and then put in the address of your server. Now this connection string I'm showing you is for MySQL or MariaDB. You can go, there's these connection strings websites out there that can help you create a connection string for SQL Server. Specify the username, the password, and the database. Make sure you got the right database name. And then here is going to be the NuGet package that you picked for your particular database type for Entity Framework Core. In my case, I chose the Pomelo choice for my SQL. And then you're going to specify the folder that you wanted to put the entity models in. So I'm going to call mine entity models. Press enter. And if you haven't got the right NuGet packages installed, or if your project won't build, it'll let you know right away here. Luckily, I've got all the right packages installed for that command to work. And so it's going to generate everything for me. As you can see on the top right here, entity models folder, it created a note. I only have one database table that we created, but we can run this command again to regenerate this stuff and just pick a different folder. Instead of typing entity models here, I can call it entity models 2, and it can generate a second folder if I wanted to see what it was like before and after, and maybe not just overwrite what I've got. It just depends on what you're trying to do, right? Anyways, so I've got that one table created here, and it does some interesting things, like it added a 1 on the end because my database and my table had the same name basically. When it's singular, made it singular. That's okay. As long as it knows how to write back to the database, which it does. The context file is the way it gets its connection and it gets context to be able to execute Entity Framework. You'll understand this pretty soon. You're going to need to move all your sensitive information to a secrets file. I recommend for this you watch my video on secrets. I cover multiple ways of using the .NET Core secrets, which could be moved up to Azure, or just having a special config file that you don't put in source control if you don't want to use secrets. That's all covered in the secrets video, so we're not going to cover that here. Instead, we're going to move directly into building the user interface and hooking the user interface up to items in the database reading and writing, because that will be the basis for an application for you. Let's begin, or let's continue. Now, one thing I will do real quickly before we go on to that UI, even though we're not going to do the connection string in a secrets in this video, is I am going to stick it in the app settings.json just to make things a little easier to get started. So I'm going to put a connection string right here, and it's going to be just like we had in the context. Change this is from an old project I used to work on here. We'll change this database to notes. And it's the same connection string that we had in the other place. We'll save that. Go over to your program.cs. Toward the top, we're going to add these few lines here. So what we're saying is we're going to get the default connection from app settings.json. So you'll call it default connection here underneath connection strings in the root. So we're going to have builder.services.addDB context. That's specific. And we're going to do here where I have data context, you actually need to get the name of your context. I could use DB context, Or if I want to be really specific, I could use notes context in case I have anything that's not inherited. So we'll put notes context. And you might need to do a control dot on that. And do using and collect the name of your entity model class that was auto-generated. I realize this is lowercase notes. That's because it came in from a lowercase notes in the database. MySQL and MariaDB oftentimes just work better depending on what type of system it's on with all lowercase. I know that's different between Linux and Windows, and it also varies based on your config file. So if you're interested more about that, we can have a discussion in the comments. Come down here to the options. I'm going to do a control dot on the use MySQL. I'm going to pick those libraries from the NuGet packages we installed earlier. If you're not seeing them, sometimes you got to close and reopen Visual Studio depending on which updates you're on. I've seen some strange bugs. So in my case, using Entity Framework Core. And moving on, I've got the get connection. Let me make this a little larger for you guys in case you're trying to copy it. So in my case, I'm actually specifying the MySQL version. That's not always necessary, but I found with the MariaDB implementation, it's made it a little less buggy. All right, so now we've got that service available to us. I'm going to show you how you can test this. If you decide you want to test that your database connectivity is working before you move on to the next step. So this is optional. You might want to fast forward, or if you want to see how your database can be tested, follow along. So we're going to go over to a controller. So if I come out here to pages, I forgot I was in Razor Pages here, but come out to pages. Let's go to our index page. And this will be the same in MVC as it is in Razor Pages, but we're over here in the controller. We're going to want to inject. So let's say on the get, when the index page is loaded, we want to execute a SQL statement. We could do that right here. So what you want to do is you want to put your context right here. So you do private, read only, and what we're doing is SQL injection. I have another video on SQL injection if you're interested, but it's pretty simple. I think you could just follow along here. And right here, you typically put the interface. You don't have to put the specific context. I'm going to go out to program.cs. This is the notes context that we're going to be doing, but I could take in any DB context. But let's just do notes context. Later in this video, when we do services, you'll see I'll put an interface here, but we're just going to do notes context for this one. So we've got our read-only context there, and we're going to inject it by putting it here in the constructor. And we'll just call it context without the underscore. And we'll assign our local context here. So if you wanted to see that you could get some data out of there, we could do context, my data, context dot, and now we can do the notes table. Now here we're going to do a little bit of link. We'll just do first or default, saying we're going to get the first or default record where, why don't we do the ID column equal to 1. And you always need the double equal if you're comparing things. Obviously, C# single equal sign is assignment, double equal is comparison, but you already knew that. Set your breakpoint right here and go ahead and run it. Now, we want there to be actual data in there, so I'm going to pop back into the database and I'm going to insert a column manually to test this. Now, you could insert with SQL if you don't want to do it this way, but I'm going to insert it this way. So we don't need the ID because it's auto increment. Last modified, we're going to enter 2022. Let's do June. I don't know what today's date is, but let's just say 15th. We'll put a note. Hello, this is my note. Data vids. And then date created is going to be, let's say, the 14th. Let's execute that. And we actually have to remove this so that our number of columns match the number of values. There we go. So now if I was to select this real quick, you could see there is data with an ID of 1. Excellent. So let's go ahead and run it. That got to our breakpoint. I'm going to hover over my data, and as you can see, hello, this is my note from database. So this is how later on we are going to get our data, except that instead of getting our context this way into a controller, we'll be getting it into a service, and that service will be defined with an interface and a class in the program.cs. So let's go ahead and delete this for right now. We'll stop it from running, and we'll delete that, get rid of that breakpoint. So come out to your pages folder, and we're going to modify the index.cs.html. That's the main homepage, the first screen you see when you land. We're going to put a text box out there, and we're going to have a save button. And every time we load the application, we'll pull out the most recent note from the database. And every time we save it, we can save the note. Lots of different things we could build. Of course, I'm trying to build you the simplest application possible so that you can go home and make your own application. Now, go out to www.root and the CSS folder. You'll see this site.css, which doesn't have whole much in it, but there's a lib folder with Bootstrap and jQuery. So you do have access to those type of libraries for JavaScript and CSS if you're interested in using them, but you don't have to use them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a div here. I'm going to give it the class name of container, because that's going to allow me to use the Bootstrap formatting to create columns and rows to make things look the way I want. So then inside the container, you're going to have a row, and then in the row you'll have a class. So div class equal to row, and then in here we'll have 2 columns to organize our form the way we want it. Div class equal to column, and this is going to be the screen is divided in Bootstrap into 12 columns, so we'll use 3 of them to put our labels, and we'll use 4 of them for our controls, which will be 7. That won't be using the whole screen, but it'll be using a good amount. And of course, you can use call small, call large, things like that if you're trying to make it responsive. But again, we're doing it the simplest thing possible. So here we'll have our note. So we could say something like, edit your note here, edit notes here. And then we'll have another column, 4, to make up 7. And we'll have the text area here. And we'll give it an ID of note text. And we'll give it a value. It's going to come from the model. Now, we haven't added it to the model yet, so why don't we do that and then we'll come back here. So index model, if you hit F12 on that, if you're new to Razor Pages, you're coming from MVC, they just plop the model inside the controller. There's not much to it. So I can add any property here and it'll become available. So if I type prop tab tab, I do a string tab tab note text, that property is now going to be available. We've got our note text property here. And it's really easy to get it to show up, but we want to add two attributes. The first one is kind of self-explanatory, right? Required. You've probably seen that in other implementations of .NET Web other than Razor pages, but if you come up here to the top, you do need to include system.componentModel annotations. No problem. The other one is bind property. You want to use the bind property attribute if you want the users to be able to edit this property in the form. If you just want to display it, it's not necessary, and you definitely don't want to put that there because it will allow whatever is modified in the UI to show up in this property. Okay, so next up, let's come back to the UI. We don't need value. That's kind of in previous types of implementations, and you want to have more columns because you want it to be wider than it is tall, right? That's kind of silly looking. I like to just drop them down once I get a bunch of properties so it's a little bit more readable like this. Now, if you're using that bind setting that I just showed you, you've got two choices. But regardless of which one you pick, don't use a self-closing tag for text area. It needs to be like this. So inside here, if it was read-only and you didn't care if the form submitted it, you could just do @model dot and then note text, the name of your property. But 99 out of 10 times if you're putting something in a form, it's because you want the users to edit it to be able to submit something to the back end. So leave the area in between the tags blank for now, and we'll just add another property to the text area element, and we will call this ASP-4 equal to, and now the name of the property. Make sure to wrap it in quotes. Note text. We're going to wrap this whole container in a form. You don't need to put it outside the container, but that's what I'm doing. Makes things a bit cleaner to see your columns and rows like that. Now, form only needs one attribute in Razor pages, assuming that you've only got one form on this page and that the action is titled appropriately. So all we've got to do is say method equal to post. Now let's create another row so we can nicely place our submit button. It could be a button or it could be an input type equals submit. I'm going to use input type equals submit, and I'm going to copy and paste this just to save a little bit of time. This will make sense here in a moment. So I'm ending my new row, I'm ending my new column. This is where the submit button is going to be, and this is just going to be an empty thing here. I like to put a non-breaking space here, but you don't have to. So here we'll put our input, and it's going to be type equal to submit. And that is a self-closing tag, unlike the text area. So we've got our form method post, input type equals submit, and if you come back over to the index.cs, I've got some code that's actually identical to what you'll find on the Microsoft documentation because I didn't have anything of value to add to that, but I will change up what goes here. So we've got our model state valid, like we were mentioning before, based on this required. So this you'll get inside this block if there's nothing in the text area, and it'll just take you back to the page without any changes. Otherwise, we get to do what you put in this block, and you can redirect them to any page you desire after the form submits. The bind property ensures that anything edited will show up in the properties themselves once you get here. Let's take a look at how that works by running the application. Here we go. And you'll notice that was async. It's not necessary. But if you want to have asynchronous calls like for Entity Framework save, for example, then you make it this. Otherwise, it could just be action result without being a task. Let's take a look. Oh, and it would not have async here. Just be on post. Here we go. So I pulled this out of the database with the service. And now we're going to add new text here. This is my new text, if I could spell correctly. And you'll see submit is lined up with edit notes because of the column in the container. I'm going to hit submit, and I've hit my breakpoint here. Let's hover over note text, and as you could see, this is my new text was pulled in. So what's next? Let's hit F10. Yes, it passed the model state. So we need to add some code here using the data service to go ahead and write back the changes to the database. And we'll go build a new service. So I like to put builder out into its own variable sometimes, but you don't have to do that. So what you could do here is just type builder again, services, and we could do add scoped or add transient. We'll do add transient. And we're going to call it, how about database service and database service. And I'll explain what these mean in a second. Okay. So what we're doing here is we're adding a service to our application. We're saying that service has this, implements this interface, and here's the instantiation of it. We have to build both these classes, but they're both really simple classes. So just come out here to add class, even though it's interface, database service. We'll just change this from class to interface. And our first method is going to be, let's call it string get note data. And we don't have to know what it does. We just have to know what parameters it takes to put in here and what it returns to put here. All right. Now we're going to need our database implementation. So you can make it a separate file. You can put it in the same file. I've seen people do it both ways. You could add a class, database service. I'm just going to put it in here. It's such a small program. Public class database service, and it's going to implement using the colon database service from above. I'll do a shortcut here. I'll do control dot on this, and I'll say implement the interface. As you can see, it pulled out the get note data from here. And we're going to need to get access to the database here to get our string out. So we need a constructor. So we'll do public database service. And in here, we're going to bring in the database context just like we did in the controller earlier. Now, before we get too far ahead, let's go back to program.cs and do control dot on this and make sure we can find it. I click the first using, and now they're both found. Hit F12 on this to come back in here. Let's go ahead and start getting our context out. Since we put it in the pages earlier and we don't need it in there, I'm actually going to pull it out and move it to where it belongs. Control X, cut. Control V or Shift Insert to paste it here. Control dot on this to determine that we need using entity models. As you can see, it went green. And same thing with the constructor here. We don't need this anymore. Oops. We can put that over here. Oh, copy, paste, fail. Well, that's all right. We know what we need. So over here, we're going to do a notes context, and we'll do a context equal to context. And just to clean this up a little bit over here, I'll get rid of that. And now over here, we have access to context. So we could return context dot notes dot first or default. And you could go right into the property, but first or default might return null. So instead of returning that, we're going to do a var DB result, database result, equals to notes.first or default. Now, if DB result is null, then we can return string.empty. Otherwise, we can return dbResult.note1. And the reason for that is if I went just .note1 here, while it would let me do it, if there was no note in the database, it would throw a null reference exception error because that's null. So how could you access a property from a null object? Obviously, right? All right, so we're ready to use this service. So back over here in program.cs, since we said that we are going to make this injectable here, I can now take this interface and apply it to our model/controller here, the same way that we did logger and the same way that we did context earlier. So I'll do private read-only iDatabase service. I don't have to specify the implementation because that's done in the program.cs for us. That's how dependency injection works. The program.cs tells the model what it's receiving. The controller what it's receiving. The controller does not know what it's receiving. It just knows that whatever it's receiving implements that interface. So it's going to receive this database service. And then down here, just like we did with the context, we will have an iDatabase service, except it's interface, right? Database service. And again, just like context, service equals service. There you go. Now it's accessible to us in the get, which is what gets that first view, the index page to display to the screen. We want to put it into the model. So our model was note text, or model property that is going to be database service dot, and the method we just created, get note data. Definitely jumped around a bit, but now it's time to come back to our post async and go ahead and update these records in the database or insert them if they don't exist. So let's go ahead and get the results. Var result is equal to await. Since we're in an async method, let's take advantage of that. And we'll do our context, which I think we called in this case database service. Not really the context is in the service, right? And then we'll do, as you can see, there's get note data, but that's the only one we built. We want to build a new one. Add update, and we're going to pass in that note text property. And what do we do if it fails? Well, we could redirect to an error page, or we could set another property that doesn't exist yet with the error text and show it on the screen. That might be the easiest way. But temporarily, we could just throw an exception so that it takes you to the default error page for the entire site. I'll do that for now just to save some time. But as you can see, you've got quite a few options. And my recommendation, if you want to do it, would be to add another string property without these attributes, just called error text. And you could have a @model sign dot my error text inside of some kind of a bootstrap alert or something like that on the main page. So for now, if result not result, we'll throw an application exception. Error in database logic. And let's go ahead and implement this. So control dot on add update. And we're going to generate the method. Hit F12 on that. It only generates it in the interface, and that's okay. So go ahead and copy that. And down here, paste it without the semicolon, add some curly braces, and here we are going to start by copying this piece, get the notes. If there is not a note yet, then we'll insert it. So we could do our context in our service dot notes dot add async. Since we're in an async method, that means we gotta await. And here we'll do new note brackets, curly braces, control space, date created is going to be datetime.now. And if your server's running in UTC mode, just be aware that that's going to save in UTC, as it won't on your workstation, as I discovered at my job. And then control space to get the ID was auto increments. We'll skip that last modified. If you don't have in your database already something to make that happen, you could do it in C#. Datetime.now. Control space and the node itself, which is really what we want, which is going to be the note text, which is the parameter to this method. Semicolon here. It's underlined in red because we added the await, which means this needs to be async. So we'll go ahead and control dot, make method async. All it did was add this async right here. And the interface might not be happy because we don't have a return yet, but we're not done. All right, so if it was null, we're adding it. Otherwise, we need to update it. So let's get the note from here. So DB result, and we'll just change the note property, as well as a couple other fields. So let's put some curly braces around these if and else, since we're going to have multiple statements in the else. Can't do one or the other. Has to be both. So DB result dot, we'll leave the date created alone, ID stays the same, modified becomes today. Again, you can handle that in SQL if you want. Now is not a method. And we'll change the note to note text from our parameter. Now, regardless of whether we did an insert or an update, we need to save it. There is an async save available to us. So we'll do another await, and it's going to be the context. Save changes async. And that should cover it. There is one more thing. Back in our C# file, we're expecting this to return something, not to return void. So it can't be a void task like this. It should be a task that returns something. So let's make it return a Boolean. And down here, let's make this a Boolean. And if everything goes well, we're going to return true. So let's do a try here. And a catch here. And normally you'd put exception and you'd log that exception, etc. But we're not doing that here, making it a short and simple program. And actually your save method can be inside the try. Sorry for that flip-flop there. In the catch, we're going to return false to let the caller know that we failed. But if we don't hit the catch, we'll return true. Excellent. All the errors have gone away. And let's see why we're not implementing it. It says it cannot implement the interface because it's not public. Just add public here. And that error went away as well. And looks like we are ready to test. So let's rebuild the solution. To test this, we got to try making the field blank as well as running it something already there. So I'm going to hit F5. And we're going to add an extra line here. This is my second line. And I'll hit submit. Step into this. I use F11 to step in, F10 to step over. Those are the Visual Studio defaults, but you could change them. So if I hover over DB result, you can see that we got the original value from the database, which is different from what's in note text because we added the second line here. So hit F10 again, and it was not null, so we don't need to do the add. We got into the else block, so we're doing an update, changing those two values, and then saving it. We didn't hit the catch because there is no error, so we'll step back out and return to the page. All right. So we probably want to have that property. I was going to skip it to make this short, but we want to see if there is an error or not so we can tell the user that it saved successfully. But before we put that in, let's go back to the database and make sure that it's saved. Just a simple query here. I could say select note from notes. I'm just saying select star from notes. The results show down here. I'm going to expand this. As you can see, this is my second line is included in the results. I know some of you might not be on a full-size device, so I'll just put it here. So we got our results. Good to go. Let's go back to our application. If you go out to the Bootstrap web page and you take a look at alerts in the documentation and you want it to look like this, there's an error or informational message or whatever you want. Pick whichever one you like the best. I'm going to pick the red one, simple danger alert, and just copy and paste it from here. This will make sense in a moment. Back on the index page, let's go ahead and pick the area that we want to put that in. I'm going to say just above the form. We don't need this learn about, but welcome sounds pretty nice. So let's put it right here, and we will put in here model dot, and we'll pick a property that doesn't exist yet. Let's call it form result text. Put that in my clipboard. Now coming back in here, and you might want to hide and show that div with some JavaScript, or you might want to put a property in there to hide and show it. We could do that. But for right now, I'm just going to put another property here. String form result text. And by default, it'll be blank. And down here in our post, instead of throwing this exception, we could set this property equal to this text. And otherwise, we could call it note updated successfully. There's one more thing. This redirect to page, I know it's in the Microsoft example, but it messes up the model when you do a redirect. We want to keep the model that we've got already, so we're just going to return a page. I know it seems like we're repeating the code, but really not, because if this is invalid, we don't do all this. If it's valid, we'll keep going. We want to do this before we return the page. So right here, instead of redirecting, we'll return the page. That way we don't lose this model information from these properties up here. If I did redirect, it would come back in and it would hit this again. So it may not be very intuitive, but that's why we do this. So we'll run it first to get the success, and then I'll show you how we could test the error. So go ahead and run it. You can also test that other thing we mentioned earlier by having an empty example by deleting that data out of the database. But also, I'll show you how to get rid of this empty red spot in a second. So let's call this third row ABC. I'm going to hit submit. Hit F10 through here. Shift Alt Enter to make that bigger. F10, we get into the success block, updating the note, save the changes. We don't hit the catch, therefore we return true. Because we return true, we go to note updated successfully and return to page, hit F5. As you can see, note updated successfully. Let's try the error condition now. So we're going to go ahead and stop running it, and I'm going to go to the database service. And right in here, inside the try block, I'm going to throw an exception intentionally. Throw new application, exception, blah, blah, blah. Go ahead and run it. Turn off that there. And let's hit submit. Error in database logic. That's perfect. That's what we wanted to see. All right, we're almost to the end. Bear with me. Thank you for watching so far. I'm going to remove this intentional exception. And now we're going to conditionally show that red area. And you could also make a green area for success if you want. We could do that real quick. I'll show you how to do that. So let's take this here and paste it here. And we'll call this alert success, I believe it is. I don't know if that was blue or green. And oops, success. And we'll put an if statement here. If, and we'll do model dot, and there's no text. So you don't need the @ sign on model because there's an @ sign on if. You only need one per statement here. So if the model says show error, we'll make that a Boolean. Then we'll do this. Else we will do this. Pretty simple, right? So if there's an error, danger, otherwise success, but the message can be the same. And let's go ahead and create this property. Control dot sometimes doesn't work in a Razor file. Let's go over to index.cs.html. Put another property, prop tab tab, Boolean, tab, show error, and let's default it to false. We might want another one when you think about it, because we don't want to have an empty blue or green box if we haven't saved it yet. So we could also do an if statement on the outside, model.hasSubmitted, and wrap both of these if statements in that. Save that, go back to here. Just clean this up a little bit for you, it's a little easier to see. And we'll do prop tab tab, bool tab tab, has submitted, and by default has submitted is going to be false as well. All right, so we've got to set these two. So down here, if the form successfully posted either way, then we're going to want to say that it's submitted. So we could say has submitted equal to true. And we have multiple statements here, so we'll do curly braces. And we could say show error, put that in my clipboard, is going to be true. Otherwise, multiple statements again. Show error is going to be false. Save everything, and we'll run it. So it's hidden. We might want to put some spacing here, but you don't have to. Fourth row. Submit. Oh, successful. And let's go ahead and throw our exception. I could just turn the database off instead of throwing an exception, but then you'd have to wait for it to time out. Why don't we do that, and then I'll fast forward the video so you don't have to wait, but I will wait. So what I'm going to do is go to services.msc, and I'll go to MariaDB. I'm going to stop my database temporarily, and I'm going to go ahead and run this. But I should stop the database after it's already started so that I can get through the onGet before it errors out. So I'll go ahead and start it again and stop it. Just assume I stopped it after we started, okay? As you can see, there's a lot of work sometimes it goes into testing, so you should not underestimate how long it takes to test. So we'll hit F5. Program's running. We've loaded this from the database. Now we'll kill the database. Come back to our program, add fifth row, and if I hit submit, I should get an error. Error in database logic. That's it for today. Hopefully that helped you. Thanks for watching DataVids, and I look forward to hearing about your feedback. Have a great day.